Hey friends, Jeff here with a new episode of Conversations Life Science Leaders Aren't Having. It's exciting. Our first episode of Season 8 of the podcast. Hard to believe. We've welcomed almost 60 guests over those 8 seasons, and they have shared their hearts, their stories, and given us all a deeper insight into what it looks like to live and steep yourself in the life sciences. And I'm excited that in this inaugural episode of the season, we invite Ira Spector. Ira is the CEO at SFA Therapeutics. SFA is a development stage biotech startup focused on a revolutionary new treatment of chronic inflammatory diseases. Who Ira is to me is impact. And that really came home for me when he shared the story of the decision that he made to go into drug development. He was considering the healthcare field, and an advisor told him, if you go into healthcare, you'll affect one patient at a time. If you go into drug development, you'll have the possibility of impacting millions. And Ira's on a mission to impact as many people as he possibly can. Through the course of this conversation, we get an inside look at how he sees the startup space, how he sees the industry, and his strong invitation to us all to focus on disease progression and not just symptoms. For even us as the public, as consumers, that we take a stand and demand a focus on disease progression. I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation with Ira Spector. Ira, it is so exciting to have you. Welcome to the show. I'm excited to dive in, and especially here as we kick off season 8 of the podcast. I'm excited that you're our first guest of the season.
Thank you.
So I just did a brief introduction of you and who you are to me and the time we've gotten to know each other. Why don't you start us off and let us know what you're up to in the world?
So what I'm up to is leading a biotech startup, actually 8-year-old startup, that is developing drugs from substances found in the human body, in the GI microbiome. We are taking substances that are made by bacteria in the GI microbiome and turning them into drugs. And we think this is a revolutionary way to treat disease.
I'm curious, you were very specific, an 8-year-old startup. You've been doing this for a long time, Ira. I'm wondering, at what point in your mind, or maybe, I'm curious, at what point does one graduate or an organization graduate from the category of startup?
Well, I think small biotech is always about raising money until you've got the product to that point, which you've proven that it works, and you've gotten embraced by either the strategics or the VCs at a high enough level. And we're just on the edge of that. So I still think of us as a startup. However, we have very exciting human data, and in more than one disease. We're on the verge of publishing that. We think we have proof of concept. And after our Series A raise, which we're just starting, we'll run the phase 2-3 adaptive trial that we think will be definitive. So I think that's right about where you cross that threshold from startup to established.
Yeah. And I'm wondering the mindset of a startup, you know, the raising money, reaching certain stage of of development and trial. I'm wondering, what are still the characteristics that you both hire for and you cultivate here 8 years later?
So the first thing is, remember the goal is to prove this works in patients. So every day it's, what have we done to get to that goal? What have we done to advance toward a submission? And what do we need? What is must have that we need to do to get there? Not what's nice to have, what's must have. And in terms of hiring, we look for people who have that mindset of, how can I do this efficiently to prove that this works for patients? It's a very different mindset than when I worked in big pharma and when I worked in big biotech, where we had a lot of administrative things we worried about, and we've stripped all of that out. This company is completely focused on, what do we need to do to get a submission to prove this in patients?
I find, because again, the externals of whether startup or not, do you have the funding or not, those are there, and you pointed to those. I'm wondering, what would you, even when you were in big pharma, I could imagine that level of efficiency, of focus, of prioritization that I'm hearing is, while maybe funding is not in question, it's still critical, even at the much larger sized organizations. I would imagine that those characteristics are things that you've been looking for and desiring on your teams for a long time.
Oh yeah. Well, big pharma is a machine. And think of a manufacturing company. In manufacturing, if you're running operations, your goal is to continually reduce costs, to squeeze out operational efficiency every year. There is no difference in a big pharma. If you're running operations, you're constantly looking for ways of reducing costs, reducing time, being more efficient with your people. But you have a different mindset for how to do that. You can offshore. You can use functional service provider models. There are various ways that you can approach solving that efficiency problem, but you're running a very big machine. And in a very big machine, there's always slack. There's ability to shift from one project to another. In a small organization, your resources are very, very precious, and you have to make very quick decisions in terms of how you deploy those resources and how to use them most effectively. And sometimes those are tough decisions that you have to make very quickly. And it's not like big pharma or biotech where you've got a committee or you've got recommendations. No, the buck stops with the senior team, and the senior team needs to be aligned and able to make those decisions on the fly.
Yeah, I had a client of a very small startup. He would always say, Jeff, small is beautiful. He thrived in that environment that in many ways you're describing is the essence of the startup mindset. And he loved it. How would you say, I'm sure there's parts and pieces of the very large and of the small startup. What are the parts of the startup mindset that you especially love, that just lights you up?
Decision making is very quick. Personnel decisions are very quick. Gaining consensus, as I'm still a very big fan of consensus amongst the team, is very straightforward. We can agree to disagree. We can have arguments. We go in a room and we work on those, and then we walk out and we're a team. Mm-hmm. It's much more difficult if you're aligning a global organization. I implemented a system in a big pharma, and the implementation team had 150 people on it in 22 countries.
Mm.
Implementation in a small company, it's, usually 3 or 4 people. And it's accomplished very quickly. So small is beautiful in regard to speed. Small is difficult in regard to resources. So you have to be very efficient and very thoughtful about how you spend money. And one of the things we've learned is that you can be very, very efficient compared with big pharma if you strip out and only do what is necessary for the next decision. And by the way, the FDA is not the reason for you to have to spend a lot of money. I actually feel the FDA promotes efficiency, promotes creativity. It's often big pharma that's wants to do things the way they've always done them. We've partnered with the FDA on some things that we think have enabled us to go fast and be smart about it. But the lack of resources forces you to think differently, and I think that's a good thing. It's a good thing for patients because it could reduce time and cost for development.
I love your reference there at the very end. It's good for patients. You said something to me in one of our earlier conversations that it's always about the patient, and even when it comes to a piece of data, that piece of data is a person. I imagine you got into this because of the patient. How is your view of the patient, of the person, the individual behind the cell or behind the data, how has that evolved for you over your career?
So I've always believed that it's always personal. There aren't universities devoted to training people to do clinical development. You won't find a course in Clinical Science 101, as a curriculum. The public rarely even understands this industry and all of the complexity of what goes into developing a new therapeutic or a new diagnostic or a new vaccine. The reason people get into this business when you talk to them is there is almost always a personal connection, a friend, a parent, a relative who had some disease. In my case, it was my older sister. And as a child, my parents were told she was going to die. And my parents found someone who treated her, saved her life, but then the side effects caused other downstream diseases. And so it's been a saga. As a parent, one of my children had certain issues which were also considered life-threatening. And so I have tremendous empathy for parents of children with chronic illnesses. But I think it being personal gives you a sense of urgency and importance for what we're doing and why we're doing it. And to me, that's ultimately what you have to think about. You have to think about your real customer, your real client. It's not the FDA. It's not the company you may do a licensing deal with. It's not your investors, although they are very important, and we're very grateful to them for sharing in the risk of what we're doing. But ultimately, it's the patient.
One of the quotes that we love on the show is from John Ruskin. He said, the greatest reward for your work is not what you get from it, but who you become by it. As you think about your career, Ira, who have you become?
So I'm pretty clear. I've become a drug developer. And that was an aspirational goal. And I think back to one of my professors who was an advisor in college when I was trying to decide what to do after my undergraduate work. And he said, if you go into medicine, you will probably spend your career treating one patient at a time. if you go into research, you have the potential to impact millions. And I've never forgotten that. We have the potential in this industry to help millions. And I think that's a profound responsibility. What have I become? My goal is to help heal the world. And you help heal the world, improve the world, in part, in my way, by helping patients and helping change the course of disease. That's what we're about.
Hmm. And I've come to believe that who we become and who we are even transcends us professionally. You as a professional drug developer, I'm wondering your nature, how you see the world. How does that even transcend your professional calling?
So you cannot disengage, and you cannot have a sort of a work persona and a personal persona. They are one. And for me, that means being data driven, making decisions based on facts and data. It means understanding fundamentally, if you can, what is going on, what is happening. Don't accept the stated dogma or obvious, but really understand first principles what's going on. In our case, that's about biology. Understanding the biology is the key to everything we do. Now, I'm trained originally as a physicist and electrical engineer. So for me, it's about modeling that biology and looking at processes and feedback loops and how inputs and outputs in the biology affect the person, affect the outcomes. That's a slightly different view than many classically trained biologists or medical personnel. I think having that different approach toward problem solving using modeling gives me a rare ability to sometimes see things others don't see. But I also expect and accept that others have different viewpoints, and it's at that intersection that exciting things can happen. So earlier in my career, I helped re-engineer how we went about doing clinical development. Was an early adopter of what is now standard, which is paperless drug development. We were 99% paperless at Wyeth in 2006 before the world was even thinking about electronic data management. We built our own systems before there were commercial systems available. Again, model the problem and see how you can change and make it more efficient. But now we're doing the same thing with disease. We're asking fundamental questions about what substances do to affect systems in the body, and how by changing the availability of these substances, we impact disease. And that's really profound. And I think it's very cool.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I hear both from clients and podcast guests who sit in this, your peers sit in the CEO seat, is there's this tendency sometimes to that there's a distance created between them and their seat as CEO and the science. And obviously that might be a less of a gap in a small organization and a bigger one in a larger organization. But I'm wondering, how do you keep your finger? What are some of the specific things you do to keep your finger on the scientific pulse?
Well, I'm very intricately involved. That's one of the benefits of a small company. The chief scientific officer, the head of clinical operations, the head of translational science, we meet often, frequently, and we get into very deep discussions about science. In bigger organizations, that's more difficult. But even when I was in big pharma and big biotech, running clinical operations, I always wanted to understand the fundamental science behind the drug. Why did they think it was going to work? How it was going to work? And in a few cases, made contributions to the design of the protocol based on what I learned and based on experience. It's a business that builds. You build on your prior experience, and you bring that experience to each system and each problem. But I think having firsthand exposure to patients is critical. Big pharma does some nice things, bringing in patients to talk. In small pharma or biotech, it's fairly easy to get access to what's going on with patients, to see what's going on. So, I think the patient always has to be front and center in the discussion.
Mm. The name of the show, Ira, is Conversations Life Science Leaders Aren't Having or Aren't Having Enough of. I'm wondering, what's your first thought when you hear me frame the name of our show?
My first thought is that as an industry, we are far too focused on treating disease symptoms and not treating disease. We're on the edge of a revolution. We have gene therapy. We have targeted drugs. We have our drugs, which are coming out of the microbiome. We have a revolution in new technologies. And we're still thinking about how to treat symptoms. That, to me, is just plain wrong. The public pressure on the drug industry, because they perceive costs and time, could be tremendously changed if we started to deliver on the promise of changing disease. I mean, that is a tremendous, powerful thing that or focus that we should be having. And that's really what we should be devoting to. That we have the tools now to change the course of disease. So that's what we ought to be thinking about. And that's not a conversation we're having. I mean, I even remember the first drug I worked on in like 1992 or 93, and it was a line extension. I never want to work on a line extension again. I only want to work on things that fundamentally can change the course of disease. I'm very reticent to use that cure word, 4-letter word, begins with C, but that's what we should be aspiring to. We should be aspiring to returning the body to normal, homeostasis. And that's what we're not doing. We are like lemmings. We see another target and everybody rushes to the new target. And we don't step back and ask, is that target going to impact symptoms, or is that target going to cure a disease? Yet we have the basis for doing that now. And that's what we ought to be putting most of our focus on. And if we did that, I think the public perception would be, wow. Right? Because we have an aging population. Longevity is an important factor that people are thinking about. And we're still thinking about symptoms. That, to me, is a complete disconnect for the industry. So the conversation we ought to be having is about how do we change the course of disease.
It strikes me, Ira, that it's one thing to have the conversation. It's another thing to have the courage to make the decisions to put the focus on disease progression and not symptoms in the face of pressure, whether it be investors, whether it be the public at large. yeah, it strikes me. It takes a lot of courage to live, to walk the talk. A coach of mine said, Jeff, values aren't your values until they hurt. And it feels like, at least for us, time to talk about it and then make decisions based on that requires a lot of courage.
Well, this is hard. There is no doubt this is hard. There is very little reward for prevention. You won't get a drug approved. Getting a drug approved for prevention, how do you prove it? How do you statistically prove prevention? It could take years. So that's very difficult. But changing the course of disease, you can prove. It's just that it's very hard, and it's hard to get that funded. And what's the compensation mechanism for that? So part of my training is in epidemiology. And if you look at causes of death and mortality, and you look at factors that have had a profound effect on life extension, vaccines, especially childhood and infant vaccines, have made a profound effect on society, starting in the late 1950s and through the 1960s, the eradication of polio, infant mortality going down. So vaccines is one form of public health prevention, profound impact. 1972-ish, seatbelts had a profound effect on mortality by reducing automobile deaths, and then later airbags. Statins have had a tremendous effect on cardiovascular disease and all of its sequelae and life extension. So those are the three big ones. When do we have the next and the next and the next of those major inflection points? That's what we ought to be about. How do we make those major societal inflection points by changing the course of major disease mechanisms? And we're getting to the point where we're starting to really fundamentally understand the mechanisms and the biology. Okay, Alzheimer's is one of those targets. Diabetes is one of those targets. Introduction of insulin, of course, did that for type 1 diabetes, but I think we'll do something similar to type 2 diabetes. But I think that instead of just making people feel better or feel good, but they still die of the same things, I mean, that's the other thing. If you analyze what we die from the same things. We live a little longer. Okay. And before COVID, life expectancy was going up roughly 0.1 years per year. So every decade we gained a year. COVID set that back, depending upon whether you talk about Caucasians or people of color, worse in the people of color population, but it set that back 2 or 3 years. But we're going to get that back on course. But how do we make fundamental interventions in disease progression? And what are the next treatments that are going to do that? That's where we should be placing our bets, and that's where the biggest societal payoff is. And that's exactly what my company is trying to do.
And we're not talking about days and weeks. I mean, even you mentioned 8 years at SFA. This requires a tremendous amount of tenacity and resilience to tackle what you're suggesting and inviting us to tackle. How has that evolved for you? Just it's the stick-to-itiveness. What's at the heart of that tenacity for you?
I just can't think of anything more important. I've had a very good career. I have no complaints. And I've had several careers because I've worked in medical devices before I went into pharma, and a few other things. So it's a journey. I just think that if you try to think about where you spend your time, and given that we all have a limited amount of time, so where are you going to spend that time that has the greatest potential to have a major outcome for society? And I think treating disease and changing the course of disease and returning the body to normal has got to be the greatest potential payout. Is it easy? No. Will this take, the average drug takes 8 to 10 years from invention to clinical proof of concept, or even commercialization. We think of the standard commercialization model, but we don't always recognize how much time was spent in research before, that molecule was the one that went into development. So it's longer. So it's a very long journey, and it takes a lot of resilience, and it's going to have ups and downs, and it's not always a straight line, and you need fuel or capital to get there, but you have to have a focus. I call running a drug company a lot like driving a car at 90 miles an hour down the road with one eye out over the hill and the other one right in front of you. You've got to have that sort of dual focus, the long term and the short term. And that's what you have to do. But the long-term focus is how do we change disease?
And one of my clients reminded me once that there many people in this industry will spend their entire career and not experience a single drug being approved, that they've worked, that they've poured into it. And I think that also speaks to this tenacity and even just this belief that what they're doing is worthwhile, even if it doesn't get approved.
So your validation isn't in the approval. Your validation is that you made the journey and that you tried to make a difference. This is a high-risk business. It is not a business for people who need short-term gratification. If you want a job where you desire short-term gratification, go into construction, build houses, paint houses. I mean, you'll see a result in hours. This is a tough, long-term business, and it's got ups and downs and risks, and it takes years. And especially if your work started in the lab, it may take many years to see that turn into something. And it may not actually be right. The biology could be wrong, and you could be working on the wrong problem. So that's the other side. It's not just blind tenacity. It's always questioning, being informed, adjusting, changing course, learning, redirecting. So it's not that you pick a target and that's it. That's my target. It's that you learn as you go. And you can, we used to have a model, learn and confirm. I think it's a very good model. You still learn as you go. And so clinical trials, by the way, do not need to be static. We've made numerous amendments to our trial because we've been learning as we go about the best way to treat patients, the best way to use the drug, the best patient population. So this is a very dynamic process.
Ira, if you could seed in the minds of your peer CEOs in life science one conversation that they're going to have with their team over the next week, what's that one conversation you would love every CEO, life science CEO, to have with their team over the next week?
First of all, learn from adversity, learn from problems. Do not let a setback stop you. It's all part of the experiment. It's all part of the journey. It's data, learn from it, and then move forward. That's the one thing. The second thing is that as an industry, we have a certain dogma that has grown up with the industry. We've largely got an industry that largely people learn through mentorship. You know, you learn from others in this business. And we have some dogma attached to this. And part of that dogma is this single target, single channel drug development mantra that we have. And I think it's a myth. And I think it's a myth because the human body has exquisite parallelism and complexity. And the more we learn about the biology, the more we learn that as we push down on one target, another one goes up. And unless we're aware of that complexity, we just chase that one target like lemmings and we all go after that target. We don't help patients because we find that the drug may only work in that small subset of patients where that target is genetically predominant, or patients may adapt or disease may mutate, or they may find that the drug starts to lose effectiveness after some period of time. And so we have to start to think holistically about the whole intricate array of complementary systems in the body and how to address those parallel paths. So that's the other thing I would tell people, is that the single target concept is a myth. And if that means we need to do polypharmacy, or if that means we need to look for higher up targets that control multiple pathways, but the model needs to be redirected toward the origins of disease, not the etiology, not the downstream effects, which is unfortunately where a lot of drugs focus.
It's really good. I love the idea of bringing those hard conversations directly to your team so that you can, if you need to, make changes and shifts in approach. Ira, as we wrap up today, would love to give you a space to highlight anything that you would like about SFA and your work and what's coming up. What would you love to highlight?
SFA is a pretty unique company. SFA is focused on the concept that there are substances made by bacteria in the GI microbiome that act on the immune system, that are immunomodulators. And if you look at the epidemiology of patients with autoimmune disease, you find that some of these substances are not present in those patients. And if you provide those as a drug exogenously, you have the potential to replace what the body's not making with substances that have evolved in humans over eons. And so they have very, very low genotoxicity. So just like we replace insulin in patients who can't make it in their pancreas, we can replace these substances in patients and change the outcome of disease. It's a pretty radical idea, and we think we're ahead, and we think it's going to change medicine, just as I think gene therapy is going to change medicine. And so I think the idea of returning the body to normal, homeostasis, ought to be one of our goals, and it's what SFA is really aimed at. And I think this is the beginning of a revolution, because we have seen a couple of patients who have had, we'll call them functional cures, patient with disease for 25 years where nothing worked, is off treatment for 3 years with no return of symptoms. You don't see that in drugs that treat symptoms. And we think we're onto something radical. Is that easy to prove? No. Is it easy to prove with a small budget? Double no. But in terms of what we're trying to do, I just think it's very exciting. It's why I'm still doing this. And I think that there are a whole class of diseases like this out there. So we're just scratching the surface. We're proof of concept, and we want to be the igniter for this revolution, because we think there is a whole new approach toward discovering and developing drugs that's been largely overlooked, and we want to get that started.
Mm. If people want to learn more about you or about SFA, where can we send them?
Well, we have a website, so it's www.sfatherapeutics.com. Mm-hmm. I'm on LinkedIn.
Great.
So those are the two primary methods. We can provide the links after this discussion. But I think we have a profound opportunity to change medicine, and that's what we're about. So I would be happy to talk to people who are serious about getting involved with what we're doing.
Well, we'll make sure we put all those links in the show notes. Ira, this has been a real gift to hear your story and to have you share your experience and wisdom and what you're up to now. Thank you so much.